This is a Queen Bee Radio High School sports presentation.
The High School Football Roundup Conference Preview Week continues, and today we are talking all about the SWAL. Mark Evenstad and Matthew Goninen, our newest Queen Bee Radio sports broadcaster, joining us for this conversation about all things related to SWAL football for this 2024 season. But let's look back on 2023 because it was a very, very fun season for football in the SWAL last year. Of course, Darlington winning the conference title and getting to the state championship game before losing on a last-second field goal to a German foreign exchange student, of all things that you could possibly predict. Losing 10-7 to Stratford. Mineral Point last year 7-4, and two of those losses were by 7 points each against Darlington. And both Cuba City and Belleville made playoff appearances in 20. Fenimore looking to bounce back and make some noise after going 3-6 in 2023. Some changes to the SWAL this year. Parkview Albany leaves the SWAL to go to the Trailways Conference, and now coming in to the SWAL, we have Benton Scales Mount Charlesburg and Southwestern East Dubuque coming in from the always hyper-competitive Six Rivers Conference. And Abundant Life St. Ambrose was supposed to join the SWAL, but they decided to continue playing 8-player football. So congratulations to all SWAL teams for being 1-0 in conference play even before the season begins. But Mark Evenstad, let's start off by talking about the Darlington Redbirds. You've been on the call of their postseason runs the last couple of years, getting so close in level 4 in 2021 and 2022, but they broke through last year in 2023, played a very competitive game against Stratford, and what an accomplishment it was for that Redbirds team last year.
Well, they had some good playmakers last year. Well, not just good, but great playmakers last year. And of course, that has been leading to their success in past years. However, there's a penalty now for being so good. And that is, if you're that good, then the WIAA says you move up a division. Now, I don't know really what effect or what positive effect that there is to doing that. But, there will come a time when Darlington's not going to be so good. And then what do? Do you move them back to Division 6 or even Division 7? I don't know. I'm not a big fan of this whole competitive balance thing because, you have certain teams that I guess have dynasties. What was going on in the 1980s when Manitowoc went to 5 state championship games, or in basketball when Seymour went to 5 state championship games in boys hoops. What was done then? Well, nothing, but those teams have since fallen off the radar, and other teams have taken their place. So Darlington will try to keep doing that, keep that thing alive. They have not won a state championship in almost 30 years. So if you're saying that Darlington is so dominant, there's no chance for any other small school to compete for a championship, well, other teams have, and other teams have won. And Darlington is just a very formidable opponent for just about anybody getting to that level. And they have several silver footballs to prove it. But, Tyler, they've just had really great performances over the years from, like Ross Christ. He is a very talented player on both sides of the football and one of the better linemen. And they'll turn to him for his leadership. Talon Chris, he was the first team all-conference on both sides of the ball last year. Dante Glendenning, not much being said about this kid. All he did was, as a freshman, he was a leader in the defensive backfield for Darlington. So he'll be back this year as a sophomore, and I'm excited to see what he can do. Broker Busher, he is listed as a tight end, and he's a junior. And then the quarterback position, I've got to believe it'll be Maddox Goebel. He was a running back, at least for part of the year last year, and also played some quarterback, but this will be his senior year. And he rushed for 506 yards last year for the Redbirds. That had been kind of the key to their successes. They don't have that 1,800 to 2,000 yard running back the last several years. It's been definitely a team effort. And Maddox Goebel contributed 506 yards rushing last year. So he can get the job done, both passing the football and running the football.
Yeah, and I don't know if you had a chance to look at Darlington's schedule, Shark, but the non-conference opponents that they've got on the schedule, same as last year, they begin the season against Platteville. It'll be at Martins Field. We'll have that on Extreme 107.1 on August 23rd, a 2 o'clock kickoff. We'll have pregame coverage set for 1:40 as part of a doubleheader on Extreme that week. And then they also have a rematch with Prairie du Chien, the only team that Darlington lost to during the regular season. And then the gap in the schedule with St. Ambrose not participating in the SWAL, who do they replace that game with? The reigning Division IV state champion Lodi. That is a tough schedule in addition to the SWAL opponents because, as Matthew, you can attest to this, Mineral Point played Darlington really tough. And then, Cuba City, we'll be talking about them in just a bit. Cuba City, a very senior-laden team. I believe 25 seniors on the roster for Cuba City this year. It is not going to be easy for the Redbirds this season, Shark.
No, it won't. But I think they like it that way. Lodi, wow, what a formidable opponent there. And they have given Platteville fits over the years, where Platteville would have their first round playoff game against Lodi, usually on the road. So great matchup to replace Madison Abundant Life on the schedule. It probably was smart on their part to not enter the SWAL and get thrown into the fire, and instead stay as an 8-player football program. So that'll be good for them. For a program like Benton Scales Mount Schulberg, it's going to be tough, at least competing on a weekly basis with SWAL conference teams. They have played SWAL conference teams like in the playoffs. In fact, one year it was Darlington, but they got smoked by the Redbirds that year that they opened up in the playoffs. So these schools that are very small, don't have a lot of numbers, therefore not a whole lot of depth. They're going to have their work cut out for them competing in a conference where probably the average enrollment, Tyler, is just a little bit bigger than what these teams that are going to move over from the Six Rivers are accustomed to.
Definitely. Let's move on to Cuba City. We'll have the Cubans all season long on Super Hits 106. And Shark, you've covered them on and off quite a bit the last few years, as have I, as have Rob Spangler. The last couple of years, they've really had to rely on upper or underclassmen to really carry the burden of the offensive production and on the defensive side of the ball as well. But as we just talked about, 25 seniors, on this team, and it feels like that these names, the names of, Tyson Richard, Gavin Vossen, and Andy Leffelholtz, we've been calling their names quite a bit, not just in football, but in multiple sports as well. I'm kind of wondering, do they actually have years of eligibility left to compete at the high school level? But they had a nice season last year. They came off a playoff appearance. I thought getting to the playoffs was a big thing for that team. They did go to Kenosha St. Joseph and fell in the level one. But Shark, I have to imagine, Coach Guy Kopp and Cuba City have much higher expectations just with how loaded and how many seniors this Cuba City team has.
They came into the season last year kind of thinking the same thing, and why not? Because they had a great running back last year in Cale Dinar, and he started off very well, but then he suffered a broken leg early in the season, and he missed several games. Well, not to be tossed off to the side, they just kept on playing, and Andy Leffelholtz did a great job at the running back position. In fact, he was the first team all-conference selection last year, and he led the Cubans in rushing. So having an Andy Leffelholtz on your team, paired up with Tyson Richard, you got your starting quarterback back again for a third year. I think he'll be a 3-time or 3-year starter at the quarterback position. 1,275 yards and 9 touchdowns last year, and one of the top quarterbacks in the area. So you get those guys plus Gavin Vossen. You got a pretty formidable starting lineup both on offense and defense that could carry you through the season, and who knows, maybe you'll get a little bit deeper into the playoffs.
Yeah, but now that technology is cooperating, we'll say hello to Rob Spangler, now able to join us on the call. Rob, we're talking about the Cuba City Cubans. You've been on the call of Cuba City teams throughout the last couple of years, and Shark and I were just talking right before you jumped on about how Cuba City had been relying on a lot of underclassmen over the last couple of years to really carry the load for this Cubans team. But those underclassmen are now seniors and have had a lot of experience. And Cuba City going to the playoffs last year, I thought was a big thing for this Cuba City team. Talk about that growth that you've seen from Cuba City over the last couple of years and what expectations you have for this Cuba City team that makes a noise in the SWAL this year.
Yeah, I mean, what Mark pointed out with the key players that they have coming back, from Vossen to the quarterback Richard to Leffelholtz, those are obviously key skill position players. But really on the lines, the Cubans are, as you said, they have been young and they've taken their lumps over the last few years. But coming into this year, I feel like this is a chance for them to really have a breakout year, to really step up from kind of that 500 level that they had been at to the upper echelon. And I know, as far as conference standings go, I was joking with Mark about the SWAL that it's it's Darlington and everybody else, but Cuba City might be that team to knock on the door to maybe even kick in the door this year. And they've got Guy Kopp, of course. And I mean, that's the reason. I shouldn't say it's the sole reason. I think obviously he loves the game, but part of the reason that he has stuck around and taken those lumps is he saw what this is going to lead to, what these underclassmen are building. And the youth movement, even behind the current varsity players that are going to be stars for the Cubans this year, there's a lot of young talent still coming up in the Cuban district. So this is a program that, yes, I think they can challenge this year. They're going to have good skill. Their offensive and defensive lines will be stout, will be solid. So they're the team. Every year you go, who's the team that could scare Darlington and maybe even beat Darlington? I think Cuba is one of those teams this year on a short list in the conference. And I also think that, again, this isn't a one and done. I don't think just because, they do have some seniors that will be graduating after this year. They've got other talent in the pipeline too. So, that's one thing Guy has told us is the youth coming up is really good and has been for a while for Cuba City.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. And one of the other teams that probably has a say, being in the top of the conference, it's going to be Mineral Point. And Matthew, we'll bring you in on this conversation because you've got a front row seat to everything Mineral Point and have been following the Pointers the last few years, calling their games on MPTV. And when you look at Mineral Point last year, their record was 7-4, but when you kind of break down who they lost to, their losses were to Lancaster, made it to level 3 in Division 6, lost to Platteville, the reigning SWC champion. They were a number 1 seed in Division 4 last year, and then 2 losses to Darlington, both games by 7 points. So there's no shame in losing to some of the best in Southwest Wisconsin. And, I think that 7-4 record might be a bit deceptive as to how successful that Mineral Point program was last year.
Yeah, Tyler, it was a very interesting season for Mineral Point last year. A lot of ups and a lot of downs, starting off the season 0-2 with that loss to Lancaster and then falling 35-0 at Platteville. This season, they will open up the season with both of those teams again from the SWC. They will travel to Lancaster and then host Platteville in week 2. And kind of going to be interesting to see what Mineral Point is this year, especially on offense. On offense, they do bring back their entire offensive line, including last year's SWAL Offensive Lineman of the Year, Matthew Arrett. But besides that, it's going to be entirely new personnel for Mineral Point. A new starting quarterback, a new starting running back, and replacing all 4 starting wide receivers. So there's going to be some questions for Mineral Point to answer on offense. On defense, kind of that same thing. Of their front 7, they're going to bring back 6. And all 6 of those returning players earned all SWAL honors last year. So very solid in that front 7 for Mineral Point. But the entire secondary is going to be new from last year. So kind of wondering what that pass defense is going to look like for the Pointers as well. And just like a lot of the other SWAL teams that we've talked about, they've got a very challenging schedule besides the strength of that conference play. As I mentioned, they'll play Lancaster and they will play Platteville. But the week in which Mineral Point was supposed to play Abundant Life, St. Ambrose, they're going to take on a team that not a lot of schools in the area see, and that's Lena Winslow out of Illinois. They have won 6 Class 1A state championships in Illinois in the last 15 years. That game is going to be in Mineral Point. So very interesting to see what that game is going to look like and the rest of the schedule as well for the Pointers.
Yeah, there's no nights off for any of our teams in the SWAL. And, we were talking earlier about the new makeup, of the SWAL conference. Again, Parkview Albany leaving the SWAL. Parkview Albany, unfortunately, in their duration in the SWAL, did not win a game in the conference for as long as they were in. So Parkview Albany goes to the SWAL, but then the incoming teams, Benton Scales Mount Shalsburg, last year didn't have, the best season. They were pretty competitive the previous few years in the Six Rivers, but one of the teams that I kind of have my eye on, and I think it's really interesting, is Southwestern East Dubuque, just because there's still a bit of mystery behind, what this team, actually is. Coach Edler, does a good job coaching them. I did see them against Blackhawk Warren a couple seasons ago, and they do seem to rely on the running game, and they do have experienced running backs there. But it's also that familiarity now that Southwestern being back in the SWAL in football, that familiarity with the other teams in the conference that they normally see in those other sports. I think that's a team to keep an eye on in the SWAL this year. We'll go around the horn, starting with Mark, then Rob, then Matthew. Who are the other teams that you kind of have your eye on in the SWAL in this 2024 campaign?
Well, I'm thinking that Fenimore might be an improved team. They started out with non-conference wins, but then they only won one other game after that, and that was by a forfeit. But I don't think they're going to be a bottom feeder for very long. And traditionally, Fenimore is just a good football program, and they've got a great coach and Tyrell Rosemeyer. I think that he can find ways of getting this team into that upper half of the SWAL conference. And I would not go to sleep on Fenimore. I think Fenimore is going to be somewhat more competitive than they have been, especially from last year and maybe even a few years before that, which they've been kind of on the downside. And then we mentioned about Belleville a little bit briefly before we went on. Belleville regressed some last year. They had a great year a couple of years ago. They beat Lancaster, and they were kind of an aerial circus with the team that they had, the personnel that they have. I think Belleville is a team that's going to be very, very competitive this coming year and overcome a record of 3-6 that they had last year.
Yep. Yeah, Rob, your team to have an eye on in the SWAL this year.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with you. And no, I'm not kissing up Tyler, but I'm really curious about the Southwestern East Dubuque Co-op. I think I used to cover a lot of Northwest Illinois football on Super Hits back in the day with Galena. We carried Galena football, and so I got to see. You guys, Matthew touched on Lee Wynn. They're unbelievable, by the way. Like, oh my gosh, Mack truck football program. Like, Mineral Point better be ready for that one. But East Dubuque it's one of those schools that has over the years, they haven't consistently been good, but they have consistently produced talented players, and it's that mix between them and Southwestern. I'm curious because to me, every now and then you'll have these elite East Dubuque athletes coming up, usually skill guys, usually receivers, tight ends, running backs, those type of positions. So, I'm with you. I'm curious to see that East Dubuque Southwestern Co-op. To me, that's an intriguing new team in the SWAL. And Belleville, what Shark said about Belleville is accurate. That's a team that, again, historically in the last 3-4 years has produced, again, some really high-end skill position players, which makes for exciting football. As Shark said, an aerial circus. That's a good way. That's a good, or as the Badgers call it, the air raid offense, right? Belleville has liked to throw the football, and they've had skilled receivers and skilled quarterbacks to do it. I'm not sure if they've got that this year, but they have in the past, and so they're an intriguing team. But the team that I'm, I guess, most curious about is that Southwestern East Dubuque team. I agree with you.
All right, Matthew, your team to watch in the SWAL this year.
Well, a couple things for me. One team that I think is very interesting and that I think is going to improve from last year is Belleville. We've talked about them. They finished 3-4 in the SWAL last year, but they're returning 7 offensive starters and 8 defensive starters. And they talk about some of the depth that they have. So historically, very good athletic department, good football program. So leaning on Riker Swenson and Brennan Keys, it's going to be interesting to see what the Wildcats can do this year. And another interesting thing for me, it's kind of been the story in the SWAL the last couple of years, is what team is going to be able to take on Darlington. They've been dominant in the conference. And we've mentioned the 2 teams coming to mind, Mineral Point and Cuba City. With Mineral Point, they're going to have some questions to answer, like I mentioned, with some of their skill players. But one thing that really stood out to me when I was looking through rosters, last year's all-conference selections, and all of that kind of stuff is I don't know if there's another team in the conference like Cuba City that has such a good balance of having really high-end talent and having depth. And in a long season where all these teams are playing very quality conference and non-conference opponents, I think that's going to be very helpful for Cuba City to have some of that depth to lean on while playing into the strengths of some of their better athletes.
Yeah, definitely agree with you there. And before we wrap up our SWAL conversation, some players to watch throughout the season. And I'll give you mine. And this is just for a really odd reason. And maybe, Shark and Rob, you might be able to chime in on this. But the one player I'm going to have my eye on is Cuba City's Gavin Vossen, just because he kind of reminds me a bit of Carter Olson from a few years ago. We've seen him have a lot of success on the hardwood, and we know how explosive of a playmaker that he can be. Being in the wide receiver position, I'd be curious to see if he's going to be, a punt returner or a kick returner or something like that, because we know how electric Carter Olson was his senior year at Cuba City and helping the Cubans have a very successful year during his senior year. He reminds me very much of him. And I wonder if he's going to be that dynamic of a playmaker to really help Cuba City propel themselves for a very successful 2024 campaign. Shark, your players to watch in 2024.
Well, I got to believe with Darlington, Ross Chris. I get, the Chris family. And of course, there's lots of Chris families in Darlington. They make up about half the population, and the population is 2,400. So it's probably not an exaggeration. There's been 1,200 Chris that have contributed to the Darlington football program over the years, and the latest addition is Ross Chris. Again, what he can do on both sides of the ball, offensively and defensively, and he's a guy to watch. And then Maddox Goebel, it's going to be interesting where they put him. Will he be the quarterback? He played some quarterback last year. He had some success there, but running the football, over 500 yards rushing. Goebel just gives them that extra dynamic. And of course, they had it with Braylon Goebel last year. Now, he did play the bulk at the quarterback. But Maddox Goebel is a guy that can carry the football and carry the load. He can also throw the football, too. And he'll probably be looking for guys like Broker Busher, the tight end who had several catches last year for Darlington. So that's a program, I want to see how they do well. And who will be the big playmakers for that program this year.
Yeah, Rob, your players to watch in 2024 in the SWAL.
I'm thinking Andy Leffelholtz is the first one that comes to mind. Shark had touched on him briefly. He was thrust into the lineup due to an injury. I mean, he had played, but he became the bell cow for the Cubans. And just, boy, I mean, took off like as if he was the starter from day one. And this year, again, I mean, he led the team in rushing last year. I expect big things out of Leffelholtz. So I mean, he is, I would say probably the player that I'm looking forward to most seeing, even maybe making a jump, which is saying something because he was solid last year.
I agree with you there, Matthew. Your players to watch in 2024.
So I've got 3 players to watch. My first one is Riker Swenson, a running back and linebacker at Belleville. He was second last year in rushing yards in the conference, and with Ty Chris graduating, he is going to be one of the better running backs in the league this year. Another player to watch for me is Tyson Richard, the quarterback at Cuba City. He finished second in passing yards and passing touchdowns in the SWAL last year behind Gibson Spurley from Mineral Point in both of those categories and very close to Spurley. So he's got a lot of weapons, so it's going to be very fun to watch him. And then one more player for me in a position that doesn't get talked about as much is Jacob Phillips, a middle linebacker at Mineral Point. He is 6'6", very tall, plays center on the Mineral Point basketball team, and very talented as well. So I'm going to be interested to watch all 3 of those guys this year.
Yeah, a lot of great athletes, a lot of great teams to watch in the SWAL this year. Looking forward to seeing how it plays out. Again, we'll have the Cuba City Cubans all season long on Super Hits 106. Thank you to Shark, Rob, and Matthew for joining me for our conversation on the SWAL for this season. And we will have another episode of our conference preview for the 2024 season on our high school football roundup. Tomorrow we'll have a conversation about the Six Rivers Conference. Very excited to see how that conference is going to play out. It is very top heavy over there. Join us tomorrow for the Six Rivers preview tomorrow on the high school football roundup.